Today on TK Aquarium Adventures, the benefits of CO2. Hey guys, in today's video we're going to talk about the benefits of CO2 injection in an aquarium with the help of growing aquarium plants. Not all plants need CO2 injection, but it is a game changer. I had a lot of struggles growing plants without CO2. No matter what I tried with fertilizers, lights, I just could not seem to get them to grow to the way I wanted them to grow. In order to use CO2, there's a few things you need. You need to obviously have a CO2 tank, which you could pick up at any local gas company or paintball store. You're going to need a CO2 diffuser. That's a way to get the CO2 atomized into the tank. You're going to need a CO2 checker. That way you know if you're putting too much CO2 or not enough CO2 in your tank. And you're going to need a CO2 regulator. That way you can adjust the amount of CO2 that goes into your tank. And also most regulators nowadays have a on-off solenoid, which is really nice. So starting with the CO2 tank, that's pretty much self-explanatory. You can pick those up at any gas like Airgas or AmeriGas. They sell CO2. A lot of people use it for food and beverage. You can also pick them up at local paintball stores. There's adapters you can buy to convert a paintball can into a CO2 can. I use a 5-pound CO2 can that I pick up at Airgas. It cost me about $80. I use one on my 75-gallon that lasts me about 6 to 8 months, and I have one on my 29-gallon that I've had now running for 9 months and it's still half full. The next thing you're going to need is a CO2 regulator. You can pick these up on Amazon. You can pick them up from a lot of different companies. I know Aquarium Co-op is going to have their own CO2 regulator coming out soon. One thing you want to do is you want to make sure you pick up a CO2 regulator that's good quality, because if this fails and it lets too much CO2 in your tank, it can poison and kill a fish. Most CO2 regulators nowadays come with an on-off solenoid that when there's power hooked up to them, it turns it on. When the power is disconnected, it automatically turns it off. The nice thing about having the solenoid on the CO2 regulator is you can hook it up to an automatic timer, whether you buy a Wi-Fi timer or you use an old school dial timer. You can schedule when you want the CO2 to turn on and off, which is really nice. You want the CO2 to turn on an hour before your lights turn on, and you want it to turn off an hour before your lights turn off. You do not want CO2 running at night, because what happens with the plants, and this happened to me, and we'll get further into this later on in the video, what happens with the plants is in the daytime, they consume that CO2 and they convert it to oxygen. But at nighttime, they consume the oxygen and convert that into CO2. So if you're dosing CO2 and your plants at night are converting to CO2, you're definitely going to poison your fish, and you could wake up with a dead tank in the morning. So you don't want to do that. The next thing you're going to need is a CO2 drop checker. Just for this fact, it's a little glass ball, or sometimes they look like a teardrop that go in the tank, and they have a liquid in them that'll measure the amount of CO2 that's in the tank. Green is good, blue is not enough CO2, and yellow means you're putting way too much CO2 in the tank. So you have to kind of get a feel for it in the beginning. So you want to start out slow with the CO2 before you start really ramping it up. And you need to remember that when you start introducing CO2, you're going to have to add more light, obviously, and you're going to have to add more fertilization, because what's going to be happening is the plants are going to be consuming more CO2. They're going to want to grow more, so you need to add more fertilization. So you want to get a good fertilizer for the plants. I use Easy Green. I really like it. It does a good job. I also dose with Easy Iron once a week in my tanks. That seems to help out. I dose daily with the fertilizers. I just divide up how much dose is supposed to get a week by the day, and then I just do a little bit of dosing each day. I see that helps me a lot more in that situation. Now, I can tell you, if you run CO2, you definitely want to make sure you have good filtration. You want to have good surface agitation, and you want to add an air stone. I made the mistake in the beginning of using CO2 that I did not have an air stone, and I ran a hang-on back filter in the tank, and I ran a canister filter. So when I was setting up Bruce's tank, I took the hang-on back filter out of there, which was causing a lot of surface agitation. And then the next day after I took that out of there, I woke up. Thank God it was a Sunday and I was off. I woke up and all my fish were at the top of the surface gasping for air. So what had happened was, at night when the plants were converting the oxygen into CO2, there wasn't enough surface agitation created by the canister filter that was oxygenating the water. So the CO2 level was way high which almost killed all my fish. I freaked out. I quickly grabbed an air stone that I had from another tank with an air pump, and I put that in the tank to get the air oxygenated. I did a fast water change. I did about a 70% water change to get all the CO2 water out of the tank and get all fresh water in. And thank God I did not lose any of my fish. I would have been devastated, especially with all the amazing plecos I have in that tank. So that taught me a lot right there, to make sure you run an air stone and have good surface agitation. So what I did that day is I went and I bought another canister filter that I have that agitates the surface of the water. That's when I got the Marine Land. And then I also added an air stone that I run 24/7, and I make sure the air stone's always on and always working. So that way I don't run into that again. It's a huge mistake I almost had when I got into the CO2, and I didn't really realize, a lot of times you think, oh, it's not going to happen to me or this or that. But I can tell you from experience, I almost lost my whole tank because I was a little ignorant in not adding air stone and surface agitation to the tank. So don't make that mistake. If you're going to add CO2, also add oxygen. It's not going to hurt the plant growth. It's only going to help. You do not want to lose all your fish in that situation. Hey guys, do me a favor. If you're liking this video, hit the like button and subscribe. We're really moving up in the subscribers here. It's really pumping me up, and I really appreciate it. I got a lot of plans in the future. I got a lot of new videos that'll be coming out. As you can see behind me right there, we have a bunch of tanks that we have acquired. We're going to be doing a giant build here in the fish room in the next couple of months. I really appreciate the support. I really appreciate all the feedback and comments. So do me a favor, hit the like button, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and let's continue with the video. So there's a couple different ways you can introduce the CO2 into the tank. You can either use a CO2 diffuser. You can also use an inline CO2 diffuser. I use on my 75 gallon an inline CO2 diffuser that hooks onto the canister filter, and it has a hose that runs to the CO2 tank, and as the out water flows, it flows and it pumps the CO2 into the tank. I get minimal bubbles that way. On that tank, it was kind of like an eyesore to see a CO2 diffuser, and I didn't really want to see a CO2 diffuser in that tank. On my 29 gallon, where I have the Corridoras that are breeding now with the cherry shrimp, I do run a CO2 diffuser because that's in my garage and I really don't care. It's got a CO2 diffuser that sits in the tank there. I have noticed that on the external ones that do sit in the tank, you do need to take them out and clean them. They'll build up algae over a couple of months, so you do need to take them out. I usually just use a little bit of bleach with some water. I scrub them down, and then I let them sit in water, and then I let them sit in some prime, and then I put them back in the tank after I make sure all the bleach is all gone off of them. But CO2 for me has been a huge game changer. When I first started with the planted aquarium, I knew I wanted a planted aquarium, and I just couldn't get my plants to grow. I'm like, what's going on? So that's when I really got into the world of aquascaping and checking them, and all those guys run CO2. All those amazing tanks you see that have lush green plants and red plants that are growing so beautifully and perfect, they're highly fertilized. They used amazing substrates also for fertilization for the plants, and then they dose CO2. CO2 is just a huge game changer. So if you want to have a nice aquascape with lush plants and beautiful colored red plants, if you're going to use red plants, CO2 is a must. It's a balance. You got to balance the amount of CO2, the lights, the nutrients, and it takes a little while to get it dialed in. So you definitely want to make sure you give yourself a trial period. Maybe try out, if you're going to try out on a smaller tank, it's easier. But yeah, CO2, it makes a huge difference. There's just some precautionary things you got to make sure you be aware of, so you don't damage your fish or hurt your fish or kill your fish. You want to make sure when you're using CO2 that you're on a water change schedule, because using the CO2 is going to lower the pH in the aquarium. It naturally lowers the pH having the CO2 introduced. So I change my tank water on my 75 gallon once a week. Even though I have no nitrates in that tank, I still change the water every week, and I do a 50% water change on it because the pH does lower by using the CO2. So you definitely want to make sure you're staying on a water change schedule. I've also noticed you get better plant growth by doing the water changes weekly. It remineralizes the water, and it gives the plants more minerals to grow with. So you definitely want to make sure if you're doing a planted tank, you want to make sure you're on a good water change schedule. Some of those guys that like Green Aqua or even George Farmer and all them, They do multiple water changes a week, every couple days. So that is the key to lush, healthy green plants, big plants. A lot of them are really pretty. But yeah, water changes are extremely important. So you definitely want to make sure you do water changes. So yes, CO2 is a game changer. It definitely helps out. Like I said, you just want to be careful with it and make sure you do a lot of research on it before you start using it. I enjoy using CO2. It helps my plant growth, and it's very simple for me to do. I do know when I set up my 150 gallon tank, I will CO2 inject that because I plan on putting plants in there as well. And that I'll inject the CO2 in the sump. So I'll put the CO2 diffuser down in the sump, that way you won't see it. But CO2 is definitely an added bonus for when you're doing plants. All in all, I would definitely recommend CO2 if you want to grow plants. It makes plant growth easier. If you want to challenge yourself, don't use it. But it's like anything, you got to have a good balance. You got to have good lighting, good fertilization, and the CO2 in the tank in order to grow plants. So I hope you guys really enjoyed this video on the CO2. If you have any questions, drop a comment down below. I'll answer it if I can. And I really appreciate the support. And I just want to say thanks, guys, and have a great day.